Hi, I'm Alister Benn, and this is Vision and Light. This week I have the true great pleasure of talking to William Neill, or Bill as he prefers to be known. We had a couple of conversations this week. The first one, we were really getting to know each other. We hadn't spoken face to face before, and it took us a while to find our flow and to just sort of get comfortable talking to each other, really. So if you hear us referring to previous conversations, then that's what we're doing in this. Now, Bill Neill is someone who's been involved in professional landscape photography for nearly 40 years. He was lucky enough to work with Ansel Adams in the Ansel Adams Gallery in Yosemite in the early 1980s, and the influence that Ansel and his peers had on William's work was clearly quite incredible. He has a quiet voice. He deals an awful lot in intimate landscapes. His passion for the environment and his very, very acute engagement with the things that he's photographing are very much evident in his work. We talked a lot about his new book, which is coming out very, very shortly, called Light on the Landscape, which I've been very fortunate enough to have an advanced copy of. And it's just an incredible read filled with incredibly inspiring photographs. So please click on the link below to visit Bill's site and to perhaps order a copy of that for yourself. I can guarantee that you won't be disappointed with that on your coffee table to enjoy at your leisure. So, another great conversation with an incredible guy. Let me introduce you now today on Vision and Light, Bill Neill. Hi, Bill. How are you doing?
I am doing great today. Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you the other day, and I'm sure we're going to have another exciting conversation this time.
Yeah, yeah. Who knows which direction we'll take?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? That maybe these conversations just mirror our creativity, and it's who we are in the moment, and how we kind of connect with what the other person is saying that actually opens up doors of opportunity that maybe we wouldn't have recognized if we'd come in with a set of questions.
Well, yes, and I think we already realize we have similar thinking process and how we proportion our um, thinking, if like emotions over technique is what I'm trying to say.
Right. Yeah. So what I'd like to start with this time is just a kind of, you know, you've got this long career now, approaching 40 years as a professional landscape photographer. And I mean, there's so much has changed in that time, from the medium that we're using and also the overall popularity of landscape photography. And I'd just like a little bit of your insight into, what it was like working with Ansel back in the day, and how that kind of set you on a path that seems to have allowed you to find your way through the quagmire of creative work without getting burnt out.
Well, it was very fortunate. I started working at Ansel's Gallery in Yosemite in 1980, and every June for 2 weeks, uh, his workshops would start, and all these very famous photographers would show up. And so I got to know Ansel and John Sexton and Alan Ross, who had been working with him, but also, megastars like Joel Meyerowitz and Ernest Haas and Paul Caponegro. And to meet these people at, in my mid-20s was enlightening. And it also gave me an idea of what kind of breadth of photography was out there, how different people were making a living, how they approached their art and why they photographed. So hearing all those amazing photographers speak at an early age was very, very helpful, educational to say the least.
Sure. And so, you know, when, I mean, at the same time, though, I mean, being surrounded by these amazing photographers all the time, I mean, was it daunting? I mean, did you feel that going out with your own equipment was intimidating at that time?
Well, I was more a stubborn redhead than anything. On two photographers that I just think are my top favorites, Ernest Haas and Joel Meyerowitz, came to Yosemite to teach for Ansel and talked about being nervous about photographing Yosemite. Well, you know, it's been done, sort of thing. And this is in 1980 or 81 or mid 80s. And I was young enough, and I said, well, I don't know about that. You know, I think there's new things that could be done in Yosemite. So early on, I kind of took on that challenge.
Right.
And I'd been influenced by, say, the likes of Elliot Porter, who did intimate landscapes. And I had started out well before that in the 70s doing a lot of macro photography.
Okay.
So intimate landscapes was broadening out for me. So it grew out of a lot of exposure to some great photography and learning about, like I said, why they photographed. And I took motivation to not be daunted in a sense.
Right.
I just said explored Yosemite enough to know that there were things under my feet and up against that wall off the trail, you know, where there's something interesting to photograph. And not, you know, maybe when I was older, you know, mid-career, I would have felt like I had to lock into something, but I didn't at that time. And I had 5 years of being employed as a photographer, learning to teach as a photographer without having to worry about what sold.
Right.
So that helped me establish a style and you know, move past the influences.
Now, in terms of, I mean, obviously, I think back in the 80s, were you shooting 4x5, or were you shooting large formats, or what was the medium you were shooting back then?
In 1982, I started shooting 4x5 and used that primarily for about a little over 20 years.
Okay.
So being at Ansel's and with all these large format photographers around and seeing the quality of their prints, not just because of the darkroom work, but just the resolution, the capability. And it didn't really stop when I bought the 4x5 that it would slow me down, but I had that discipline early on where I couldn't shoot a lot. I mean, I had to save up money to get film processed, you know, between paychecks. And so I learned a really good discipline of seeing and composing, you know, with my feet. I used a couple of focal lengths, no zooms.
Right.
You know, you had to move yourself around and you had to take your time. And even when I switched to digital, that lesson, 20-year lesson, if you will, you know, helped me be able to deal with and enjoy faster moving photography, but I still had the skill or the experience of, you know, framing up an image and paying attention to all those details that you can see easily with a 4x5 in the back. And,
yes.
And because when you click a shutter, it's a serious commitment.
Yes.
That helped me early on. I also had Polaroid film. So I was teaching for the gallery and walking out into the meadows with a Type 55 positive Polaroid film, so I could shoot with the 4x5 and pull off a little Polaroid print, and show my students.
Wow.
Here's this composition, here's how I metered it. And fortunately, the Polaroid Type 55 had a latitude similar to slide film, so it gave me a sense of the contrast issues. And it was nice to be able to show students that. But it also helped me learn, because I just jumped into 4x5 and didn't really know what I was doing.
Were you shooting 35mm before that?
Yeah, I was shooting film.
Right.
From my first camera was in 1974. So I used 35 millimeter film up till getting the 4x5.
Right. You know, I'm a big kind of, one of my big areas of inquisitiveness, I suppose, is how our personalities are linked with our creativity. You know, how our personalities and how we're motivated, and the kind of spectrum that we live on in terms of our emotional spectrum. These are all things that I'm quite fascinated with. And I'm curious because, you know, you talk about being a fiery redhead in your 20s, and having the kind of sense of will almost to kind of take on these legends of landscape photography in the amphitheater of landscape photography. And obviously at the time, you know, shooting 4x5 requires this much slower, methodical, kind of clear-headed approach. You know, and those two things are quite diverse. I mean, so do you think that these are both ends of the spectrum that you feel comfortable in? Is that strong sense of opinion and will, coupled with a kind of steady, secure approach to taking your time and being patient?
Well, I think I learned early on that making mistakes was a useful part of the learning process. So I made plenty of mistakes, and I also just gave myself permission to explore, to not photograph when I didn't get motivated. So I think that's a big factor. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
not entirely. Yeah,
pin me down a little more.
Well, it's that emotional spectrum that I'm interested in. Is that, you know, do you feel when you go into the landscape, especially one that you're very familiar with, that this range of who you are is reflected in the types of things that you photograph on a day-to-day basis?
I think it's reflected in the need for a peace and meditation, like a calm, you know, walk through the woods away from the tourists. And it's restorative in the sense that it's quiet, and restorative in the sense that I'm seeking to focus on beauty, and that is a calming thing, and it's a positive thing for me personally, and a positive thing to share. So early on, I had read, not widely read with photography, but reading the words we talked about earlier about minor white. You know, be still with yourself until the object of your attention affirms your presence, which is basically a non-aggressive approach to seeing what you see, not over planning, not being disappointed if what you planned or hoped might happen doesn't happen, and just, you know, walk around until it hits you.
Right.
If it doesn't, that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you know, I'm a bit of a Zen meditative sort of individual, and my approach in the landscape's obviously exactly the same by that. And it's very much inspired by people like yourself, and as we've talked about, Minor White. In terms of this, when you've had a career spanning 4 decades, we've seen quite a few trends coming along. We've seen different styles become fashionable and popular. Have you found yourself kind of getting caught up in the trends, or the business pressure of having to make photographs in a certain way to be successful? Or have you felt that you've been able to maintain a certain amount of moral and creative integrity throughout the duration of your career?
Well, I think I learned fairly early to sort of segment my approach, because I needed to make a living, and I did things that helped that. A line of posters that sold, you know, widely really helped support me a lot, or books. And back in the day when you were actually getting advances and, you know, sold enough books to make, you know, good royalties. But I always had the gallery outlet to show my best work. I tried to channel some energy towards the commercial side, but like being able to show my Yosemite work in Ansell's gallery.
Mm.
You know, I back then I picked what images went up on the wall, and I could make my artistic statement in that venue. So these days it seems to be all a little more lumped together. Back then, you know, you had stock photography, or like the posters I mentioned, and then somewhere else, maybe a gallery, like I said, that you could make the more personal statement. So I always had that outlet, while I still had, I guess, the common sense to, or the need to support my family. So, you know, I put work out there that I might not have put up in the gallery. It's a compromise for sure. Sometimes I wish, you know, I wish that my best photographs always sold and never had to have one commercial concern. But as I was telling you the other day, Ansel always talked about his long career as a commercial photographer, and he was very proud of it. And he didn't want people to think he was just some highfalutin artist that never, you know, would get down the dirt, so to speak. I mean, he did all kinds of assignments, and he had a studio in San Francisco. So that, you know, that showed me that there was a way to be somebody like Ansel Adams and still, you know, he had to support his family, and he did commercial work to do that.
Do you describe yourself as an artist? Is that a sort of self-recognized term for you?
Yeah, sure. I don't know if I have a word that I lock into. I'm an artist more than a photographer, or it's kind of I have a broad sense of what photographers can be, so I don't try to narrow it down too much. Another photographer that influenced me a lot in that sense was Ernst Haas, who was, you know, a photojournalist, doing assignments for places like Life magazine, but he did serious art in the process, and that was a enlightening thing for me to see. And he was open to photographing lots of different things.
Right.
I mean, if you ever want to see one of the greatest photography books, you know, look at The Creation by Ernst Haas, and it's wildlife, it's all kinds of different things. And it's illustrative as well. It's a storytelling thing. So his ability to tell a story from his photojournalistic background enabled him to compile this amazing book. Big influence on me.
Talking of books, I spent quite a bit of time this afternoon with your retrospective book, and the thing that really struck me looking through it was a real boldness to put out there images of extreme minimalism, you know, really held together with almost like a dream, you know. You know, it's just, I think it takes a certain type of confidence in your own work to put something down on print that can feel either very minimal or it demands engagement as well. Is this something that, you know, how important do you think self-confidence is in the creative process?
Oh, I think it's a huge thing. You want to believe in yourself and you know, be willing to experiment. Like I said earlier, being willing to fail and go through the cycle of learning and failing and trying to improve and learning and failing and experimenting and failing and learning, and it goes. I mean, it's a constant
trend
loop.
Forming here, Bill.
It's a constant loop. I'm photographing my irises that are in bloom now, and I'm trying all kinds of different things with it. Just find it entertaining. It energizes my day.
Right. It's The thing with a lot of answers that you're giving is that the first thing you say triggers something in my mind for another question, and then something else comes along during the conversation that gets it completely out of my mind again and demands another question.
Let me tell you one thing to further answer that question a minute ago. Is I would rather take a photograph that asks a question than answers one.
Right.
So if you are trying to include all the possible context, it has a great value to do that. You place the viewer in the scene. But if you are taking things out that and making things more simple, more minimalist, then you leave some mystery for the viewer. First of all, scale might be. I might play with scale, so not putting a reference of a foreground in.
Mm-hmm.
Not putting the reference of the sky in, and you have that wondering what's going on, and hopefully it's more than just confusion, that it's a sense of wonder quite directly.
Right. So this sense of wonder, something we talked about quite a lot last time, and we before we get onto that again, there was the thing that kind of came into my mind before was that we talk about self-confidence and the need to fail. Do you think that contemporary landscape photographers, us in the here and now, are struggling more because of social media and the kind of external validation aspect and the sort of fear of failure in public? The audience now is so much more huge than perhaps it was 30 years ago. You could kind of fail in private, whereas now we're all failing in, it's easier to kind of fail in the grand scheme of things with 100,000 people watching you.
Yeah, the pressure of getting response to your work on social media is detrimental to the artistic process in lots of ways. Back when I started out, validation came through a curated system of a book publisher. Will the editor like this book idea? Will the gallery hang my work? So somebody else was deciding. So it's wonderful that people get to make their own decisions about what they put out there, uncurated. But if you're just developing and you have the pressure of whatever attention you want to have for your work, then it pushes you in directions that might be towards the more popular type of imagery and not to what is really deep inside of you.
No, yes, absolutely. And this is a recurring conversation I'm having with a great spectrum of people. I was speaking to Sarah Marino yesterday, and her beautifully fresh approach to the whole genre is so stimulating and exciting. And it's someone that's just really sticking to their guns and creating what they want to create. And I think, one thing I feel about your work is that you've been very true to yourself. And you talked when we last spoke about this sense of wonder. Would you like to elaborate on that? You're taking a hike through the forest on one spring morning, and the light is interacting with the forest and the rocks. How does your creative awareness awaken?
Well, if I go out for a walk, I know I'm going to find something interesting. So if I go up to Yosemite, which is an hour and a half from here, and the dogwood are blooming, and that's sort of where my focus is, or a certain weather condition is happening, I'll get myself out there because of those reasons, but I'm always trying to look at things from multiple angles. What about something entirely different than what I expected?
Right.
It's like one of my favorite photographs. Probably my favorite photograph is my Dawn Lake Louise photograph.
Yes.
And I went to Lake Louise, like so many do, at sunrise, waiting for the clouds to part and the sunrise light to hit the glaciers. And, got up at God knows what hour, 4:35, to get there pre-dawn. And it was, when I went there, I've only been there once to photograph, and that wasn't happening. And I don't remember, rejoicing because what I expected didn't happen, but I just watched, and I just wanted to try to see what I could do with what I got, what I was given. And the exposure was very minimalist and about 2 minutes long, so it was pretty dark, and unexpected results that I had forgotten all about it.
Right.
On a 3-week photography trip, and when I got the film back, several weeks later, I was going, I couldn't remember where I was, because I'd been to Moraine Lake and I'd been to other famous places in that area, and I've been to Glacier National Park, and those things had overtaken my memory of that dawn at Lake Louise. And I took 2 frames. I said, to get excited, let's try. I probably started with the horizontal, then I tried the vertical, and having something in the foreground gave a little mystery depth to it. So anyway, that kind of event, unexpected, turned out to be my favorite photograph. Who knew?
It's in the start of the book. It's that blue, moody sunrise with the glacier kind of in the shadows in the background.
Yeah, just when the clouds were down, covering the glacier. But
yeah, it's not what one would consider spectacular sunrise light, that's for sure.
Right. But it worked out. So
it did work out. Before we get on to talk about your book, I'm curious to ask you, what's your view on the whole way that photography tends to be taught as a series of repeatable rules? I'm curious to hear what the smile was very telling.
Yes, rules I don't like. So I've heard you say that, and I think they're very useful to have some understanding of how good composition works. And I wrote a chapter for a book on composition. It was published in England, and I spent all this time writing the chapter about placing things in the frame and foregrounds and backgrounds and edges and all these things, and turned it into the editor, and they said, well, where's the part about rule of thirds? I said, well, I didn't write about it. I'm not really keen on latching onto that. And they said, well, maybe you could write something. So I wrote a very explanative description of what it's about, and when I might, go back and look at images already taken and see how this placement worked well for this design. And it was funny to have to dig in and write about it, but I gave a guarded account of my feeling about its value. So yeah, it's a fast track. People want to get going. They want to know how to design a photograph, and knowing some things like that can be helpful. But I've taught a lot online for quite a few years, and I've had people submit portfolios that show every photograph is applying the rule of thirds, especially in broader landscapes, a third foreground, third middle ground, third sky. And I asked the leading question, so are you applying the rule of thirds here? Is that something you're... And so I let them know it's, if you see 10, 20 photographs with that same pattern of design, then it gets too obvious. It's something, there might have been a shot with incredible clouds and only a third of the photograph is sky.
Right.
And I always refer back to Ansell's moonrise photograph, which is about 2/3 sky.
Mm-hmm.
And about top half is nothing but sky.
Yes.
And the feeling of space is great, and it works. Anyway,
it's a curious one, because I think you're the person with the longest career in landscape photography I think I've ever spoken to. Because we're the kind of, I'm 53 and I'm still a young guy, I guess, in the sort of landscape photography thing. But something I look at your work, and I've looked at a lot of your work, both in the retrospective and in your new book, Light on the Landscape. And there's no evidence in it whatsoever of any formulaic compositional repetitiveness. You see a lot of photographers where, as you said, every photograph is basically on a grid, it's on a template, and none of your work's like that. And my argument is that, well, do they serve any purpose at all other than fast tracking people into homogeny?
Well, it fast track into relative success too. It's like, well, that's a nice, pleasing balance. It may not, give the right emphasis to the sky or the foreground by, aiming flat straight ahead. It might have been better if that foreground was so amazing that maybe you aim down a little bit and the top quarter or less is the sky and
a quarter or less. Yeah.
Oh my God, that's dangerous. Risky. But again, it's trusting your instincts and saying, what looks right in the frame. It's kind of locking into what's inside that frame and how things balance. And somehow I have trusted those instincts for a long time, and God knows why, but I'm happy it worked out that way.
I strongly suspect that when you and I are in Yosemite together next year, we're going to have a very long conversation about this. I am horribly opinionated when it comes to the whole teaching of rules, and actually don't think they serve any good positive value at all, and they end up blinkering us to other opportunities that may be more natural for us.
Yeah, and more suitable to the subject.
Quite. Yeah, I think the subject and our relationship with it is the trigger that creates the composition and the balance and the harmony. Anyway, we can sit in Yosemite next year and pursue this one further, because I'm getting more opinionated the older I get.
Yeah, and I think that I see people that are less involved than we are about making photographs. They're just kind of dabbling, and so that fast track thought is at least gets them in the ballpark with a basic formula. Of course, nearly all people would settle in on that formula and not ever try to break out. When I critique people's work, I see something that I think maybe could have been better, so I always ask them, what else did you do? And they often say that's about it.
Right.
I thought that was the composition, and I had great confidence, so I took it. And I said, well, what about if you had moved to the left or right or up or down, whatever it is? So I always encourage people to really work a scene and kind of work through possibilities, from focal length to where you're standing to depth of field, all those things. Photographing waterfalls in Yosemite, when I first started teaching in the early 80s, people wanted to know what shutter speed to use. And I still hear people saying, well, this is the shutter speed I like. I never do that. That's a rule.
Yep.
This water's got to be this, amount of seconds or quarter of a second or whatever. And I love digital, where I can go take 100, 200 photographs with dozens of frames. Even with my Sony, I set it up to take 5 frames every time I trip the shutter with a waterfall or some kind of moving water, and let the bracket the position of the water, like photographing how the spray bounces off a rock. There's no way to tell what one shot is going to be successful. If you have 10 or 20, you got a fighting chance. You got 100, you got a better chance.
Now we've got your secret bill.
Yeah, it's like, well, it's really weird for a 4x5 photographer to say that. It's fairly opposite, but I've gone to the dark side of lots of digital frames.
That's going to become the quote of this talk. Is
the dark side.
The dark side. I would like you to tell me a little bit about your new book, which you were very kind to send me a digital copy of recently, and I had the pleasure of sitting down and looking through it. And it's something of a kind of a celebration of your regular article, accompanied by some of your amazing photographs. So how did the idea come about, and what are you trying to achieve, and are you happy with it?
I'm thrilled with it, first of all. I started writing for Outdoor Photographer in 1986, and in 1997, I started a column. They asked me to write a column. So the book encompasses 60 essays from the 138 essays I've written for them. So paring it down to the best. But it's been a great process to force myself to think about what I'm doing, because I don't really like to dwell on these things. I just like to keep my head down and do more work. But the article allows me to look at photographs I've taken and say, what is in here, what lesson does it provide? And I've always tried to make the essays that I wrote for Outdoor Photographer much more about the creative side than the technical side. You know, there's information in them about shutter speeds and maybe apertures, some basic things, but it's all within the framework of why is this photograph creatively successful, if I judge that anyway. So yeah, it's been wonderful to get the articles together, and there's a fair amount of new work in it, in the more recent columns. So there's a range of work that I'm really pleased with, because it shows my impressionistic work, for example, or some of my light box work, where the salsify seed, that's a detail shot, that's straight into a light box, or things that I collect around my property, like the elderberry leaves, just leaves I picked up off the lawn and put in a box and photographed them in nice light. But it's my way anyway. That sort of range, I think, is an important part of the book.
Right.
That I'm going on trips to photograph, lava flows, or I'm picking up leaves off my lawn.
Right.
And something we talked about the other day is that I've thought about more and more, is the need to engage yourself with the beauty around you every day, wherever it is. If it's, in the middle of a city and there's a tree sticking out of the pavement, and you can bring some life to it in a photograph, that's of great value for yourself, to be reminded that of these things that are comforting to us and bring us joy.
That sounds very much like the meaning of a life to me, is to see a sense of wonder in the world around us on a daily basis. Yeah.
As I said the other day, it's a ballast. And there's a lot of bad things out there. I can go on and on about that, and it weighs on people. It weighs on me just like anyone. And if I'm checking out my irises today and seeing which one's ready to pluck and photograph, that's where balances things out.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something I've been talking a lot about. I talked with Sarah yesterday about it, Guy Tal a couple of weeks ago, where we're talking about the landscape being our kind of emotional ballast. And it's the place where you can just go and forget about or not forget about it, but be so fascinated with something outside of ourselves that we don't have time to just continue ruminating. I think your work is a very clear representation of that. I think so much of it is just little moments of fascination. Do you look back now on your photographic life, and is there anything you would have changed if you had a chance, or do you feel that it's been fulfilling and you've pretty much hit it on the head?
Well, I do feel like I'm very pleased with what I've been able to do, but also I think the way I was able to do whatever I've done is by not looking back, is by moving forward. So I'm just the Protestant work ethic, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. I'm head down and keep cranking out the photographs. That's a bad term. I don't think that way. But to keep looking for those things that give me that sense of wonder. And I see a lot more things that give me a sense of wonder than I could ever photograph, or that would make good photographs.
There's another conversation in this in the future. I can feel it coming on, because we've kind of touched on things today that we didn't touch on a few days ago, that are very much my key focuses these days, which is the creative process and our engagement and wonder with the world is almost, to me, more important than the product and the sharing and getting it out there. There's a definite value in that, of course, but you know, you are a commercial photographer. You made your living as a photographer. Has it ever got to the stage where the pressure to create in a commercial sense kind of got in the way?
Well, I think I've been pretty good at giving myself a break on how things are going, because I haven't had a regular paycheck in 30 some odd years. So it's exhausting in many ways after all these years. Things, there were the good old days, and there's so much competition now. Maybe today isn't quite the same, but like I said, I just try to keep engaging in what brings me joy. I mean, photographing a flower on a light box isn't particularly the most creative process, but I keep trying to inject some ideas into different types of photographs I take. Photographing flowers on a light box, has led me to photographing trees against the sky, and I'd photograph them in color, of course, and go, God, that's beautiful green leaves, and that blue just is distracting the hell out of me. So I'd go desaturate the blue or overexpose somehow, so I'd photographing trees that really isolate the structure against a white sky, like I was against a light box.
Right.
So my wheels are always spinning and trying to evolve. So that keeps me going, and the exhaustion sometimes gets to me. Sometimes I just wish I could retire and not worry about the commerce at all. But the older you get, your time for output shortens. So I went for about 17 years without a book coming out.
Right.
And so I have a retrospective and the new one, and probably another one next year. So it feels good to be gathering things from the past and maybe seeing what I can add to. And again, that building themes is something I love to do. So that's what keeps me going.
Well, I'm glad it does, because I'm an avid admirer of all your work, and I know you don't like compliments, so I'm not going to embarrass you any further. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, Bill. It's always just a joy to speak to you, and I think you're very understated and quite humble about what you've achieved in landscape photography, and but it is appreciated. It's very much appreciated. Your words and your photographs. So thank you very much again. I hope we get to do this again, but obviously we're definitely planning on coming over to the States next year, and I think we're planning on getting together anyway. So
good. Well, we'll see you in Yosemite.
Yeah,
sounds good.
Yeah, looking forward to that. And the curry will be much appreciated also.
Yes, we'll make sure that comes through. My wife will deliver.
I'm excited
She's
about
she's
that.
a great cook.
I bet she is. I bet she is. Yes, very excited about that. Well, thank you very much, Bill, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. And I'm looking forward to our next conversation. And thank you very much for all your work and words.
Thanks for having me.
No worries, man. No worries.
All right. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.